Okay, so our first speaker is Casey Spackman, who is currently a doctoral student here at Utah State in the Department of Wildland Resources. His work is based off a collaborative grant between the USDA ARS Poisonous Plant Research Laboratory and the Department of Wildland Resources here at USU. His focus is on livestock grazing behavior, or in other words, how do you get animals to eat something they would usually not? Casey?
So yeah, I am a PhD student with the Department of Wildland Resources, working with Medusahead and livestock. So the first thing is, what is Medusahead? So many of you may not be familiar with it, a lot of you may. So Medusahead is a winter annual grass that has invaded a lot of the Intermountain region of rangelands, and it overtakes vegetation, the native vegetation. Here are some pictures that show what the awns look like that deter livestock from eating it, and then also some pictures here of the thatch. The reason I put the thatch up here is because Medusahead is high in silica and lays down this litter barrier for other plants, but it has an advantage to this because it actually germinates, its seed germinates within that thatch and is able to establish roots into the ground. So let's talk a little bit about Medusahead's bad reputation. A lot of people say Medusahead is an invasive annual grass that is bad for the environment. Bad for our rangelands in particular. The reason this is because I talked about the thatch layer that builds up. It causes these wildfires. It's a fine fuel for these fires, so you get an accumulation of this fuel for more frequent and intense fires. Another thing, it smothers out the native vegetation. It takes out your native plants to where you have a monoculture. So this is one of our research sites up in eastern Washington. And as you can see, the only native vegetation is right here, and the rest is an annual grassland, primarily Medusahead. So Medusahead was about 70% up there. Another thing is livestock do not like to eat it. They will avoid it once the awns emerge. There is a window of opportunity to consume it. It's 2 weeks approximately. However, to get the stocking rates in there to consume that plant during that time is really hard for producers. However, let's define what a weed is. So Ralph Waldo Emerson gave this famous quote about weeds. He says, "What is a weed? A plant whose virtues have never been discovered." So what virtues does Medusahead have? Thanks for asking that. So let's talk about nutritional value. So here is some nutritional value of Medusahead from a study done by Juan Montez and Juan Villalba in 2017. So Medusahead has somewhere between 7 to 10% crude protein, all the way up into 12 if it's in the early vegetative stage. As far as fiber, it's fairly high in fiber content and low in digestibility with that aspect. But however, the ash content is fairly high for this plant, particularly the silica that's in it. So acid-insoluble ash, which is an indicator of silica, actually is somewhere between 10 to 15% for this plant. So let's compare the forage value of a horrible forage like barley straw. Well, it's got 4% crude protein, very high fiber, but it's digestible, and an ash content of 7. As far as tall fescue goes, much higher crude protein content, better fiber digestibility, and the ash content is high, but it's digestible. Now our rangeland plants that we often reseed with, crested wheatgrass. So if we compare Medusahead to crested wheatgrass, the crude protein content is similar, 10 to 11%. Fiber, very similar. Ash, very similar. So before I go on from here, I want to make it clear that when I'm talking about the virtue of Medusahead, it's not that I want to replace your normal forage with Medusahead. The research that I'll show from here on out is used as a way to control the Medusahead. Allow livestock to utilize the nutrients within Medusahead to eliminate it off the landscape to where we can come in and we can reseed and promote native vegetation. So why do livestock avoid the Medusahead? So I talked about it being high in silica. Silica is the main problem. So the silica encapsulates the plant, encapsulates those nutrients, and prevents degradation in the rumen. Even though it has moderate nutritional quality, but that silica causes the extremely low digestibility. Also in the environment, I talked about that thatch buildup. That thatch buildup is primarily because the microbes, similar to what's in the rumen, they're the same in the environment, cannot break down this plant biomass. So therefore you get litter buildup, you get increased fuel loads for fires, and you smother the native seedlings that are there on the landscape. And so it just keeps spreading and spreading. So silica is a big problem. So how do we overcome the silica barrier? How do we extract the virtues of Medusahead? Well, right here. RT3, Roundup. So glyphosate herbicide. And many people may shake their heads at this, but it works. We had a producer in eastern Washington that started spraying fence lines. He noticed his cattle congregating around where he had sprayed. So he extrapolated this out into one of his pastures. And here on this slide you can see where he missed some of the spraying. He's got these mist strips. And this is a monoculture of Medusahead. You can see that after grazing all summer long on this, the Medusahead was completely consumed. Whereas the stuff that was not sprayed, well, it's still standing vegetation in the fall like you can see here. So our research took this idea and we wanted to know the why and how of the glyphosate application to Medusahead and grazing. So the first thought was, this Roundup RT3 is salt-based, so maybe it's the salt that's enticing the animals to it. Well, and then we also wanted to think, well, if it's that ingredient, what if it's not salt? What if it's actually the adjuvant within it? Also, we wanted to look at digestibility of what's happening when the animals consume it, because we knew there was that silica barrier. And then also the practicality of how. So what rate do we apply? What's the optimal rate? What's the optimal herbicide type? Do we have to use that Roundup RT3? And then also the timing. What stage of growth is that Medusahead in to optimize the grazing? So here's our salt preference study. So if we look at just Medusahead alone, ignoring the grasses and forbs for a minute, right here we had more growth in the salt treated patch. So in other words, the animals completely avoided it and it grew throughout the rest of the summer. So we got more biomass at the end. Whereas if we look at the Roundup RT3, so that glyphosate-containing herbicide, we pretty much wiped out all of it. So we had close to 60% of the biomass removed off the landscape. How about for our adjuvant preference study for livestock? Well, does the adjuvant have an effect? No, similar as salt. It actually deterred the livestock from consuming the plant. But if we look at these, the RT3, then we had glyphosate with salt and glyphosate only. Anything with glyphosate in it, we got good consumption of the Medusahead. So at this point we know that it's not the salt, it's not the adjuvant. What's going on? We predict that it's something physiological going on in the plant that glyphosate changes. So let's look at digestibility. Well, first, let's look at the other grasses that were on this study. So does it work for annual grasses that were present as well? Yes. However, they also ate those annual grasses during our study. Perennial grasses, annual forbs, and perennial forbs, there was no real trend there. But the encouraging thing is the Medusahead. If we can get the Medusahead off the landscape, that's what's the focus of this. So digestibility. So what we did is we took some Medusahead and ground it up and got some rumen fluid from some cows and digested it artificially in our lab. Then we were measuring gas production. So this lower graph is what happened with the different treatments of glyphosate on Medusahead. We threw in as a positive control the alfalfa, which is this green line here and here. So we can see that the orange and the blue lines, that is our glyphosate treatments at 10 and 20 ounces. We can see that the glyphosate increased the gas production, indicating increased digestibility. Also as rate, we have increased rate for those treatments with glyphosate. Now, how about the practicality of it? So this is a study that I participated in Eastern Washington, and we were trying to decide, all right, can we use a generic, or do we have to use this RT3 brand? Also, what rate is optimal? So if we look at this, if we just look at the post-graze and the type of Roundup used, we can see that there's not really a difference between these two, or these two, or these two. So we can use a generic brand. Now how about rate? So we have 6 ounces per acre, 10 ounces per acre, and 20 ounces per acre. If we look at the gray bars, so that's the amount of biomass removed by the livestock. 20 ounces was greater than 6 and 10 ounces. However, a catch to this study was we had that thatch layer. And when we sprayed, there were some plants underneath that thatch that the glyphosate did not reach. So it acted as a physical barrier. And so that's why some of our data isn't as clear on this as we would have liked. Now, we did a study this last spring that we're still collecting data on. This is our timing. So timing of application. So we did 3 phenological stages. We did the early vegetative stage when it was just emerging, so up to 3 centimeters. We did the late vegetative stage to early reproductive, so just before the emergence of the seed head. And then we did it with the full seed head emergence. And just from what I was observing on this study, the animals did not like the early vegetative stage because of the short particle lengths. So they couldn't access those as well as the other ones. With late reproduction stage, the awns were present and they completely avoided it. However, when we did it in that late vegetative stage, just before the emergence of awns, the animals, during this time frame we did this, every single day, day in and day out, would sit there on those strips. They had a preference for that. So in summary, the virtue of glyphosate. Glyphosate provides a control tool to optimize Medusahead use by livestock and also have a control technique we can use in the field. So to answer the why questions, using glyphosate, it wasn't the salt that caused the cattle to prefer it. It wasn't the adjuvant. Somehow the glyphosate increased palatability and digestibility of that plant. As far as answering the practicality of it, optimal rate is between 10 to 20 ounces. I would not go below 10 ounces due to herbicide resistance. You start getting that low, and we risk that Medusahead would develop a tolerance. Generic brand, Roundup, the glyphosate-containing herbicide, works just as well as the name brand. And then also when to spray, late vegetative to early reproductive stages. So with that, I will take questions.
Any questions for Casey? Right here.
So glyphosate is an herbicide. Was the rate of application high enough to actually kill the Medusahead and the cattle were grazing on the dead grass? Or I guess, how does that work?
Yeah, so to answer your question, does glyphosate actually kill the grass to promote that, or does it just stunt it? Medusahead is highly susceptible to Roundup, the glyphosate, and it actually kills the plant, which is an interesting concept because if we spray it in that late vegetative stage, it cures the plant in that stage and prolongs the time frame. So instead of having that 2-week window, you can extend that to all summer long. They have that available forage.
Is there a question over here?
So I'm curious about what exactly affects digestibility. I mean, glyphosate comes with a lot of things in it, including quite a lot of phosphorus. Could that contribute to just the bacterial composition of what we have going on in the rumen? Can you kind of additionally feeding the bacteria to do a better job on the fiber?
So the question concerning digestibility, are there other things within the glyphosate that may affect the digestibility of the plant? Possibly. It may affect the microbes. We don't know. We didn't, on our study here, we did not take a sample and examine those things. It could possibly be. But the overall concept of what we were trying to do was just determine, is there a difference between digestibility overall?
Question in the middle.
Are there any negative health effects on the cows or other animals that are eating this grass and spraying?
The question is, are there any negative effects from applying glyphosate to Medusahead when cattle consume it? So the label states that there's a withdrawal period of 5 days. So to stay off of the herbicide applied plant for 5 days before you graze it. With our studies, we want to make sure that the plant is completely cured, completely dead, so we have a clear preference on our studies. And so we went out to 10 days. So we're way outside of that window. As far as the research that the glyphosate manufacturers have done, there were no ill effects that they could determine. And so we feel like we're safe within those bounds.
One more question here.
Real quick, did you test the nutrient content of the Medusahead after applying glyphosate to see if it maintained the same quantities of nutritional availability after the application of the herbicide?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't include that in, I should have included that in one of my slides. Yes, we have, and what occurs is we have an increase in cell-soluble carbohydrates, a reduced silica load on the plant, and better crude protein content.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on. So if you have questions for Casey, you can catch him after this session again. Thanks.